Chapter 23 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Von Ullman. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 23. The Island of Monte Cristo. Thus, at length, by one of the unexpected strokes of fortune which sometimes befall those who have, for a long time, been the victims of an evil destiny, Dantès was about to secure the opportunity he wished for, by simple and natural means, and land on the island without incurring any suspicion. One night more, and he would be on his way. The night was one of feverish distraction, and in its progress visions good and evil passed through Dantès' mind. If he closed his eyes, he saw Cardinal Spada's letter written on the wall in characters of flame. If he slept for a moment, the wildest dreams haunted his brain. He ascended into grottos paved with emeralds, with panels of rubies, and the roof glowing with diamond stalactites. Pearls fell drop by drop, as subterranean waters filter in their caves. Edmond, amazed, wonderstruck, filled his pockets with the radiant gems, and then returned to daylight, when he discovered that his prizes had all changed into common pebbles. He then endeavored to re-enter the marvelous grottos, but they had suddenly receded, and now the path became a labyrinth, and then the entrance vanished, and in vain did he tax his memory for the magic and mysterious word which opened the splendid caverns of Ali Baba to the Arabian fisherman. All was useless, the treasure disappeared, and had again reverted to the genie, from whom, for a moment, he had hoped to carry it off. The day came at length, and was almost as feverish as the night had been, but it brought reason to the aid of imagination, and Dantès was then enabled to arrange a plan which had hitherto been vague and unsettled in his brain. Night came, and with it the preparation for departure, and these preparations served to conceal Dantès' agitation. He had, by degrees, assumed such authority over his companions that he was almost like a commander on board, and as his orders were always clear, distinct, and easy of execution, his comrades obeyed him with celerity and pleasure. The old patron did not interfere, for he too had recognized the superiority of Dantès over the crew and himself. He saw in the young man his natural successor, and regretted that he had not had a daughter, that he might have bound Edmond to him by a more secure alliance. At 7 o'clock in the evening all was ready, and at 10 minutes past 7 they doubled the lighthouse just as the beacon was kindled. The sea was calm, and with a fresh breeze from the southeast they sailed beneath a bright blue sky, in which God also lighted up in turn his beacon lights, each of which is a world. Dantès told them that all hands might turn in, and he would take the helm. When the Maltese, for so they called Dantès, had said this, it was sufficient, and all went to their bunks contentedly. This frequently happened. Dantès, cast from solitude into the world, frequently experienced an imperious desire for solitude. And what solitude is more complete or more poetical than that of a ship floating in isolation on the sea during the obscurity of the night, in the silence of immensity and under the eye of heaven? Now this solitude was peopled with his thoughts, the night lighted up by his illusions, and the silence animated by his anticipations. When the patron awoke, the vessel was hurrying on with every sail set and every sail full with the breeze. They were making nearly 10 knots an hour. The island of Monte Cristo loomed large in the horizon. Edmond resigned the lugger to the master's care, and went and lay down in his hammock. But in spite of a sleepless night he could not close his eyes for a moment. 2 hours afterwards he came on deck, as the boat was about to double the island of Elba. They were just abreast of Marasinya, and beyond that the flat but verdant island of La Pianosa. The peak of Monte Cristo, reddened by the burning sun, was seen against the azure sky. Dantès ordered the helmsman to put down his helm, in order to leave La Pianosa to starboard, as he knew that he should shorten his course by 2 or 3 knots. About 5 o'clock in the evening the island was distinct, and everything on it was plainly perceptible, owing to that clearness of the atmosphere peculiar to the light which the rays of the sun cast at its setting. Edmond gazed very earnestly at the mass of rocks which gave out all the variety of twilight colors, from the brightest pink to the deepest blue. And from time to time his cheeks flushed, his brow darkened, and a mist passed over his eyes. Never did a gamester, whose whole fortune is staked on one cast of the die, experience the anguish which Edmond felt in his paroxysms of hope. Night came, and at 10 o'clock they anchored. The young Amelia was first at the rendezvous. In spite of his usual command over himself, Dantès could not restrain his impetuosity. He was the first to jump on shore, and had he dared, he would, like Lucius Brutus, have kissed his mother earth. It was dark, but at 11 o'clock the moon rose in the midst of the ocean, whose every wave she silvered, and then, ascending high, played in floods of pale light on the rocky hills of this second Pelion. The island was familiar to the crew of the Young Amelia; it was one of her regular haunts. As to Dantès, he had passed it on his voyage to and from the Levant, but never touched at it. He questioned Jacopo. "Where shall we pass the night?" he inquired. "Why, on board the tartan," replied the sailor. "Should we not do better in the grottos?" "What grottos?" "Why, the grottos, caves of the island." "I do not know of any grottos," replied Jacopo. The cold sweat sprang forth on Dantès' brow. "What, are there no grottos at Monte Cristo?" he asked. "None." For a moment Dantès was speechless; then he remembered that these caves might have been filled up by some accident, or even stopped up for the sake of greater security by Cardinal Spada. The point was, then, to discover the hidden entrance. It was useless to search at night, and Dantès therefore delayed all investigation until the morning. Besides, a signal made half a league out at sea, and to which the Young Amelia replied by a similar signal, indicated that the moment for business had come. The boat that now arrived, assured by the answering signal that all was well, soon came in sight, white and silent as a phantom, and cast anchor within a cable's length of shore. Then the landing began. Dantès reflected, as he worked, on the shout of joy which, with a single word, he could evoke from all these men, if he gave utterance to the one unchanging thought that pervaded his heart. But, far from disclosing this precious secret, he almost feared that he had already said too much, and by his restlessness and continual questions, his minute observations and evident preoccupation, aroused suspicions. Fortunately, as regarded this circumstance at least, his painful past gave to his countenance an indelible sadness, and the glimmering of gayety seen beneath his cloud were indeed but transitory. No one had the slightest suspicion, and when next day, taking a fowling piece, powder, and shot, Dantès declared his intention to go and kill some of the wild goats that were springing from rock to rock, his wish was construed into a love of sport, or a desire for solitude. However, Jacopo insisted on following him, and Dantès did not oppose this, fearing if he did so he might incur distrust. Scarcely, however, had they gone a quarter of a league, when, having killed a kid, he begged Jacopo to take it to his comrades, and request them to cook it, and when ready to let him know by firing a gun. This, and some dried fruits and a flask of Mount Poliziano, was the bill of fare. Dantès went on, looking from time to time behind and around him. Having reached the summit of a rock, he saw, 1,000 feet beneath him, his companions, whom Jacopo had rejoined, and who were all busy preparing the repast which Edmond's skill as a marksman had augmented with a capital dish. Edmond looked at them for a moment with the sad and gentle smile of a man superior to his fellows. "In 2 hours' time," said he, "these persons will depart richer by 50 piastres each, to go and risk their lives again by endeavoring to gain 50 more. Then they will return with a fortune of 600 francs, and waste this treasure in some city with the pride of sultans and the insolence of nabobs. At this moment hope makes me despise their riches, which seem to me contemptible. Yet, perchance, tomorrow deception will so act on me that I shall, on compulsion, consider such a contemptible possession as the utmost happiness." "Oh, no," exclaimed Edmond, "that will not be. The wise, unerring Faria could not be mistaken in this one thing. Besides, it were better to die than to continue to lead this low and wretched life." Thus Dantès, who but 3 months before had no desire but liberty, had now not liberty enough, and panted for wealth. The cause was not in Dantès, but in Providence, who, while limiting the power of man, had filled him with boundless desires. Meanwhile, by a cleft between 2 walls of rock, following a path worn by a torrent, and which in all human probability human foot had never before trod, Dantès approached the spot where he supposed the grottos must have existed. Keeping along the shore, and examining the smallest objects with serious attention, he thought he could trace on certain rocks marks made by the hand of man. Time, which encrusts all physical substances with its mossy mantle, as it invests all things of the mind with forgetfulness, seemed to have respected these signs, which apparently had been made with some degree of regularity, and probably with a definite purpose. Occasionally the marks were hidden under tufts of myrtle, which spread into large bushes laden with blossoms, or beneath parasitical lichen. So Edmond had to separate the branches, or brush away the moss to know where the guide marks were. The sight of marks renewed Edmond's fondest hopes. Might it not have been the cardinal himself who had first traced them, in order that they might serve as a guide for his nephew in the event of a catastrophe, which he could not foresee would have been so complete? This solitary place was precisely suited to the requirements of a man desirous of burying treasure. Only might not these betraying marks have attracted other eyes than those for whom they were made? And had the dark and wondrous island indeed faithfully guarded its precious secret? It seemed, however, to Edmond, who was hidden from his comrades by the inequalities of the ground, that at 60 paces from the harbor the marks ceased, nor did they terminate at any grotto. A large round rock, placed solidly on its base, was the only spot to which they seemed to lead. Edmond concluded that perhaps instead of having reached the end of the route he had only explored its beginning, and he therefore turned round and retraced his steps. Meanwhile his comrades had prepared the repast, had got some water from a spring, spread out the fruit and the bread, and cooked the kid. Just at the moment when they were taking the dainty animal from the spit, they saw Edmond springing with the boldness of a chamois from rock to rock, and they fired the signal agreed upon. The sportsman instantly changed his direction and ran quickly toward them. But even while they watched his daring progress, Edmond's foot slipped, and they saw him stagger on the edge of a rock and disappear. They all rushed toward him, for all loved Edmond in spite of his superiority, yet Jacopo reached him first. He found Edmond lying prone, bleeding, and almost senseless. He had rolled down a declivity of 12 or 15 feet. They poured a little rum down his throat, and this remedy, which had before been so beneficial to him, produced the same effect as formerly. Edmond opened his eyes, complained of a great pain in his knee, a feeling of heaviness in his head, and severe pains in his loins. They wished to carry him to the shore, but when they touched him, although under Jacopo's directions, he declared with heavy groans that he could not bear to be moved. It may be supposed that Dantès did not now think of his dinner, but he insisted that his comrades, who had not his reasons for fasting, should have their meal. As for himself, he declared that he had only need of a little rest, and that when they returned he should be easier. The sailors did not require much urging. They were hungry, and the smell of the roasted kid was very savory, and your tars are not very ceremonious. An hour afterwards they returned. All that Edmond had been able to do was drag himself about a dozen paces forward, to lean against a moss-grown rock. But instead of growing easier, Dantès' pains appeared to increase in violence. The old patron, who was obliged to sail in the morning in order to land his cargo on the frontiers of Piedmont in France, between Nice and Fréjus, urged Dantès to try and rise. Edmond made great exertions in order to comply, but at each effort he fell back moaning and turned pale. "He has broken his ribs," said the commander in a low voice. "No matter, he is an excellent fellow, and we must not leave him. We will try and carry him on board the tartan." Dantès declared, however, that he would rather die where he was than undergo the agony which the slightest movement cost him. "Well," said the patron, "let what may happen, it shall never be said that we deserted a good comrade like you. We will not go till evening." This very much astonished the sailors, although no one opposed it. The patron was so strict that this was the first time they had ever seen him give up an enterprise, or even delay its execution. Dantès would not allow that any such infraction of regular and proper rules should be made in his favor. "No, no," he said to the patron, "I was awkward, and it was just that I pay the penalty of my clumsiness. Leave me a small supply of biscuit, a gun, powder, and balls, to kill the kids or defend myself at need, and a pickaxe, that I may build a shelter if you delay in coming back for me." "But you'll die of hunger," said the patron. "I would rather do so," was Edmond's reply, "than suffer the inexpressible agonies which the slightest movement causes me." The patron turned toward his vessel, which was rolling on the swell in the little harbor, with sails partly set, and would be ready for sea when her toilet should be completed. "What are we to do, Maltese?" asked the captain. "We cannot leave you here so, and we cannot stay." "Go, go," explained Dantès. "We shall be absent at least a week," said the patron, "and then we must run out of our course to come here and take you up again." "Why," said Dantès, "if in 2 or 3 days you hail any fishing boat, desire them to come back here to me. I will pay 25 piastres for my passage back to Leghorn. If you do not come across one, return for me." The patron shook his head. "Listen, Captain Balde. There is one way of settling this," said Jacopo. "Do you go, and I will stay and take care of the wounded man." "And give up your share of the venture," said Edmond, "to remain with me?" "Yes," said Jacopo, and without any hesitation. "You are a good fellow and a kind-hearted messmate," replied Edmond, "and heaven will recompense you for your generous intentions. But I do not wish anyone to stay with me. A day or 2 of rest will set me up, and I hope I shall find among the rocks certain herbs most excellent for bruises." A peculiar smile passed over Dantès' lips. He squeezed Jacopo's hand warmly, but nothing could shake his determination to remain, and remain alone. The smugglers left with Edmond what he had requested, and set sail, but not with turning about several times, and each time making signs of a cordial farewell, to which Edmond replied with his hand only, as if he could not move the rest of his body. Then, when they had disappeared, he said with a smile, "'Tis strange that it should be among such men that we find proofs of friendship and devotion." Then he dragged himself cautiously to the top of a rock, from which he had a full view of the sea, and thence he saw the tartan complete her preparations for sailing, weigh anchor, and, balancing herself as gracefully as a waterfowl ere it takes to the wing, set sail. At the end of an hour she was completely out of sight, At least, it was impossible for the wounded man to see her any longer from the spot where he was. Then Dantès rose, more agile and light than the kid among the myrtles and shrubs of these wild rocks, took his gun in one hand, his pickaxe in the other, and hastened toward the rock in which the marks he had noticed terminated. "And now," he exclaimed, remembering the tale of the Arabian fisherman which Faria had related to him, "now, open sesame." Chapter 23. Recording by Von Ullmann, vonsbooks.com. Chapter 24 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Von Ullmann, The Count of Monte Cristo, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 24. The Secret Cave. The sun had nearly reached the meridian, and his scorching rays fell full on the rocks, which seemed themselves sensible of the heat. Thousands of grasshoppers, hidden in the bushes, chirped with a monotonous and dull note. The leaves of the myrtle and olive trees waved and rustled in the wind. At every step that Edmond took, he disturbed the lizards glittering with the hues of the emerald. Afar off, he saw the wild goats bounding from crag to crag. In a word, the island was inhabited, yet Edmond felt himself alone, guided by the hand of God. He felt an indescribable sensation somewhat akin to dread, that dread of the daylight which even in the desert makes us fear we are watched and observed. This feeling was so strong that at the moment when Edmond was about to begin his labor, he stopped, laid down his pickaxe, seized his gun, mounted to the summit of the highest rock, and from thence gazed round in every direction. But it was not upon Corsica, the very houses of which he could distinguish, or on Sardinia, or on the island of Elba, with its historical associations, or upon the almost imperceptible line that to the experienced eye of a sailor alone revealed the coast of Genoa, the proud, and Leghorn, the commercial, that he gazed. It was at the brigantine that had left in the morning, and the tartan that had just set sail, that Edmond fixed his eyes. The first was just disappearing in the straits of Bonifacio. The other, following an opposite direction, was about to round the island of Corsica. This sight reassured him. He then looked at the objects near him. He saw that he was on the highest point of the island, a statue on this vast pedestal of granite, nothing human appearing in sight, while the blue ocean beat against the base of the island, and covered it with a fringe of foam. Then he descended with cautious and slow step, for he dreaded an accident similar to that which he had so adroitly feigned should happen in reality. Dantès, as we have said, had traced the marks along the rocks, and he had noticed that they led to a small creek, which was hidden like the bath of some ancient nymph. This creek was sufficiently wide at its mouth and deep in its center to admit of the entrance of a small vessel of the lugger class, which would be perfectly concealed from observation. Then, following the clue that, in the hands of the Abbé Faria, had been so skillfully used to guide him through the Dædalian labyrinth of probabilities, he thought that the Cardinal Spada, anxious not to be watched, had entered the creek, concealed his little bark, followed the line marked by the notches in the rock, and at the end of it had buried his treasure. It was this idea that had brought Dantès back to the circular rock. One thing only perplexed Edmond, and destroyed his theory. How could this rock, which weighed several tons, have been lifted to this spot without the aid of many men? Suddenly an idea flashed across his mind. Instead of raising it, thought he, they have lowered it, and he sprang from the rock in order to inspect the base on which it had formerly stood. He soon perceived that a slope had been formed, and the rock had slid along this until it stopped at the spot it now occupied. A large stone had served as a wedge. Flints and pebbles had been inserted round it, so as to conceal the orifice. This species of masonry had been covered with earth, and grass and weeds had grown there. Moss had clung to the stones. Myrtle bushes had taken root, and the old rock seemed fixed to the earth. Dantès dug away the earth carefully, and detected, or fancied he detected, the ingenious artifice. He attacked this wall, cemented by the hand of time, with his pickaxe. After 10 minutes' labor the wall gave way, and a hole large enough to insert the arm was opened. Dantès went and cut the strongest olive tree he could find, stripped off its branches, inserted it in the hole, and used it as a lever. But the rock was too heavy and too firmly wedged to be moved by any one man, were he Hercules himself. Dantès saw that he must attack the wedge. But how? He cast his eyes round, and saw the horn full of powder which his friend Jacopo had left him. He smiled. The infernal invention would serve him for this purpose. With the aid of his pickaxe, Dantès, after the manner of a labor-saving pioneer, dug a mine between the upper rock and the one that supported it, filled it with powder, then made a match by rolling his handkerchief in saltpetre. He lighted it and retired. The explosion soon followed. The upper rock was lifted from its base by the terrific force of the powder. The lower one flew into pieces. Thousands of insects escaped from the aperture Dantès had previously formed, and a huge snake, like the guardian demon of the treasure, rolled itself along in darkling coils and disappeared. Dantès approached the upper rock, which now, without any support, leaned toward the sea. The intrepid treasure-seeker walked round it, and, selecting the spot from whence it appeared most susceptible of attack, placed his lever in one of the crevices, and strained every nerve to move the mass. The rock, already shaken by the explosion, tottered on its base. Dantès redoubled his efforts. He seemed like one of the ancient Titans who uprooted the mountains to hurl against the father of the gods. The rock yielded, rolled over, bounded from point to point, and finally disappeared in the ocean. On the spot it had occupied was a circular space, exposing an iron ring let into a square flagstone. Dantès uttered a cry of joy and surprise. Never had a first attempt been crowned with more perfect success. He would fain have continued, but his knees trembled, and his heart beat so violently, and his sight became so dim, that he was forced to pause. This feeling lasted but for a moment. Edmond inserted his lever in the ring and exerted all his strength. The flagstone yielded, and disclosed steps that descended until they were lost in the obscurity of a subterranean grotto. Anyone else would have rushed on with a cry of joy. Dantès turned pale, hesitated, and reflected. "Come," said he to himself, "be a man. I am accustomed to adversity. I must not be cast down by the discovery that I have been deceived. What, then, would be the use of all I have suffered? The heart breaks when, after having been elated by flattering hopes, it sees all its illusions destroyed. Faria has dreamed this. The Cardinal Spada buried no treasure here. Perhaps he never came here, or if he did, Cæsar Borgia, the intrepid adventurer, the stealthy and indefatigable plunderer, has followed him, discovered his traces, pursued them as I have done, raised the stone, and descending before me has left me nothing." He remained motionless and pensive, his eyes fixed on the gloomy aperture that was open at his feet. "Now that I expect nothing, now that I no longer entertain the slightest hopes, the end of this adventure becomes simply a matter of curiosity." And he remained again motionless and thoughtful. Yes, this is an adventure worthy of a place in the varied career of that royal bandit. This fabulous event formed but a link in a long chain of marvels. Yes, Borgia has been here, a torch in one hand, a sword in the other, and within 20 paces at the foot of this rock, perhaps 2 guards kept watch on land and sea, while their master descended, as I am about to descend, dispelling the darkness before his awe-inspiring progress. But what was the fate of the guards who thus possessed his secret? Asked Dantès of himself. "The fate," replied he, "of those who buried Alaric." Yet had he come, thought Dantès, he would have found the treasure, and Borgia, he who compared Italy to an artichoke, which he could devour leaf by leaf, knew too well the value of time to waste it in replacing this rock. I will go down. Then he descended, a smile on his lips, and murmuring that last word of human philosophy, "Perhaps." But instead of the darkness and the thick and mephitic atmosphere he had expected to find, Dantès saw a dim and bluish light, which, as well as the air, entered not merely by the aperture he had just formed, but by the interstices and crevices of the rock which were visible from without, and through which he could distinguish the blue sky and the waving branches of the evergreen oaks, and the tendrils of the creepers that grew from the rocks. After having stood a few minutes in the cavern, the atmosphere of which was rather warm than damp, Dantès' eye, habituated as it was to darkness, could pierce even to the remotest angles of the cavern, which was of granite that sparkled like diamonds. "Alas," said Edmond, "these are the treasures the cardinal has left, and the good abbé, seeing in a dream these glittering walls, has indulged in fallacious hopes." But he called to mind the words of the will, which he knew by heart. "In the farthest angle of the second opening," said the cardinal's will. He had only found the first grotto, he had now to seek the second. Dantès continued his search. He reflected that this second grotto must penetrate deeper into the island. He examined the stones and sounded one part of the wall where he fancied the opening existed, masked for precaution's sake. The pickaxe struck for a moment with a dull sound that drew out of Dantès' forehead large drops of perspiration. At last it seemed to him that one part of the wall gave forth a more hollow and deeper echo. He eagerly advanced, and with the quickness of perception that no one but a prisoner possesses, saw that there, in all probability, the opening must be. However, he, like Cæsar Borgia, knew the value of time, and in order to avoid fruitless toil, he sounded all the other walls with his pickaxe, struck the earth with the butt of his gun, and finding nothing that appeared suspicious, returned to that part of the wall whence issued the consoling sound he had before heard. He again struck it with greater force. Then a singular thing occurred. As he struck the wall, pieces of stucco similar to that used in the groundwork of arabesques broke off, and fell to the ground in flakes, exposing a large white stone. The aperture of the rock had been closed with stones, then this stucco had been applied, and painted to imitate granite. Dantès struck with the sharp end of his pickaxe, which entered some way between the interstices. It was there he must dig, but by some strange play of emotion, in proportion as proofs that Faria had not been deceived became stronger, so did his heart give way, and a feeling of discouragement stole over him. This last proof, instead of giving him fresh strength, deprived him of it. The pickaxe descended, or rather fell. He placed it on the ground, passed his hand over his brow, and remounted the stairs, alleging to himself as an excuse a desire to be assured that no one was watching him, but in reality because he felt that he was about to faint. The island was deserted. The sun seemed to cover it with its fiery glance. Afar off, a few small fishing boats studded the bosom of the blue ocean. Dantès had tasted nothing, but he thought not of hunger at such a moment. He hastily swallowed a few drops of rum, and again entered the cavern. The pickaxe that had seemed so heavy was now like a feather in his grasp. He seized it and attacked the wall. After several blows, he perceived that the stones were not cemented, but had merely been placed one upon the other, and covered with stucco. He inserted the point of his pickaxe, and using the handle as a lever, with joy soon saw the stone turn as if on hinges and fall at his feet. He had nothing more to do now, but with the iron tooth of the pickaxe to draw the stones toward him one by one. The aperture was already sufficiently large for him to enter, but by waiting he could still cling to hope, and retard the certainty of deception. At last, after renewed hesitation, Dantès entered the second grotto. The second grotto was lower and more gloomy than the first. The air could only enter by the newly formed opening. It had the mephitic smell Dantès was surprised not to find in the outer cavern. He waited in order to allow pure air to displace the foul atmosphere, and then went on. At the left of the opening was a dark and deep angle, but to Dantès' eye there was no darkness. He glanced around the second grotto. It was, like the first, empty. The treasure, if it existed, was buried in this corner. The time had at length arrived. 2 feet of earth removed, and Dantès' fate would be decided. He advanced toward the angle, and summoning all his resolution, attacked the ground with the pickaxe. At the 5th or 6th blow, the pickaxe struck against an iron substance. Never did funeral knell, never did alarm bell produce a greater effect on the hearer. Had Dantès found nothing, he could not have been more ghastly pale. He again struck his pickaxe into the earth, and encountered the same resistance, but not the same sound. It is a casket of wood bound with iron, thought he. At this moment a shadow passed rapidly before the opening. Dantès seized his gun, sprang through the opening, and mounted the stair. A wild goat had passed before the mouth of the cave, and was feeding at a little distance. This would have been a favorable occasion to secure his dinner, but Dantès feared lest the report of his gun should attract attention. He thought a moment, cut a branch of a resinous tree, lighted it at the fire at which the smugglers had prepared their breakfast, and descended with his torch. He wished to see everything. He approached the hole he had dug, and now, with the aid of the torch, saw that his pickaxe had in reality struck against iron and wood. He planted his torch in the ground and resumed his labor. In an instant, a space 3 feet long by 2 feet broad was cleared, and Dantès could see an oaken coffer, bound with cut steel. In the middle of the lid he saw engraved on a silver plate, which was still untarnished, the arms of the Spada family, viz., a sword, pale, on an oval shield, like all the Italian armorial bearings, and surmounted by a cardinal's hat. Dantès easily recognized them. Faria had so often drawn them for him. There was no longer any doubt. The treasure was there. No one would have been at such pains to conceal an empty casket. In an instant he had cleared every obstacle away, and he saw successively the lock placed between 2 padlocks, and the 2 handles at each end, all carved as things were carved at that epoch, when art rendered the commonest metals precious. Dantès seized the handles and strove to lift the coffer. It was impossible. He sought to open it. Lock and padlock were fastened. These faithful guardians seemed unwilling to surrender their trust. Dantès inserted the sharp end of the pickaxe between the coffer and the lid, and pressing with all the force on his handle, burst open the fastenings. The hinges yielded in their turn and fell, still holding in their grasp fragments of the wood, and the chest was open. Edmond was seized with vertigo. He cocked his gun and laid it beside him. He then closed his eyes, as children do, in order that they may see in the resplendent night of their own imagination more stars than are visible in the firmament. Then he reopened them, and stood motionless with amazement. 3 compartments divided the coffer. In the first blazed piles of golden coin. In the second were ranged bars of unpolished gold, which possessed nothing attractive save their value. In the third, Edmond grasped handfuls of diamonds, pearls, and rubies, which, as they fell on one another, sounded like hail against glass. After having touched, felt, examined these treasures, Edmond rushed through the caverns like a man seized with frenzy. He leaped on a rock from whence he could behold the sea. He was alone with these countless, these unheard-of treasures. Was he awake, or was it but a dream? He would fain have gazed upon his gold, and yet he had not strength enough. For an instant he leaned his head in his hands as if to prevent his senses from leaving him, and then rushed madly about the rocks of Monte Cristo, terrifying the wild goats and scaring the sea-fowls with his wild cries and gestures. Then he returned, and, still unable to believe the evidence of his senses, rushed into the grotto, and found himself before this mine of gold and jewels. This time he fell on his knees, and clasping his hands convulsively, uttered a prayer intelligible to God alone. He soon became calmer and more happy, for only now did he begin to realize his felicity. He then set himself to work to count his fortune. There were 1,000 ingots of gold, each weighing from 2 to 3 pounds. Then he piled up 25,000 crowns, each worth about 80 francs of our money, and bearing the effigies of Alexandre VI and his predecessors. And he saw that the complement was not half empty. And he measured 10 double handfuls of pearls, diamonds, and other gems, many of which, mounted by the most famous workmen, were valuable beyond their intrinsic worth. Dantès saw the light gradually disappear, and fearing to be surprised in the cavern, left it, his gun in his hand. A piece of biscuit and a small quantity of rum formed his supper, and he snatched a few hours' sleep lying over the mouth of the cave. It was a night of joy and terror, such as this man of stupendous emotions had already experienced twice or thrice in his lifetime. End of chapter 24. Recording by Von Ullman, vonsbooks.com. Chapter 25 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Von Ullman. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 25. The Unknown. Day, for which Dantès had so eagerly and impatiently waited with open eyes, again dawned. With the first light, Dantès resumed his search. Again he climbed the rocky height he had ascended the previous evening, and strained his view to catch every peculiarity of the landscape. But it wore the same wild, barren aspect when seen by the rays of the morning sun, which it had done when surveyed by the fading glimmer of eve. Descending into the grotto, he lifted the stone, filled his pockets with gems, put the box together as well and securely as he could, sprinkled fresh sand over the spot from which it had been taken, and then carefully trod down the earth to give it everywhere a uniform appearance. Then, quitting the grotto, he replaced the stone, heaping on it broken masses of rocks and rough fragments of crumbling granite, filling the interstices with earth, into which he deftly inserted rapidly growing plants, such as the wild myrtle and flowering thorn. Then, carefully watering these new plantations, he scrupulously effaced every trace of his footsteps, leaving the approach to the cavern as savage-looking and untrodden as he had found it. This done, he impatiently waited the return of his companions. To wait at Monte Cristo for the purpose of watching like a dragon over the almost incalculable riches that had thus fallen into his possession satisfied not the cravings of his heart, which yearned to return to dwell among mankind, and to assume the rank, power, and influence which are always accorded to wealth, that first and greatest of all the forces within the grasp of man. On the 6th day the smugglers returned. From a distance Dantès recognized the rig and handling of the young Amelia, and, dragging himself with affected difficulty toward the landing-place, he met his companions with an assurance that, Although considerably better than when they had quitted him, he still suffered acutely from his late accident. He then inquired how they had fared in their trip. To this question the smugglers replied that, although successful in landing their cargo in safety, they had scarcely done so when they received intelligence that a guard ship had just quitted the port of Toulon, and was crowding all sail towards them. This obliged them to make all the speed they could to evade the enemy, when they could but lament the absence of Dantès, whose superior skill in the management of a vessel would have availed them so materially. In fact, the pursuing vessel had almost overtaken them when, fortunately, night came on, and enabled them to double the Cape of Corsica, and so elude all further pursuit. Upon the whole, however, the trip had been sufficiently successful to satisfy all concerned, while the crew, and particularly Jacopo, expressed great regrets that Dantès had not been an equal sharer with themselves in the profits, which amounted to no less a sum than 50 piastres each. Edmond preserved the most admirable self-command, not suffering the faintest indication of a smile to escape him at the enumeration of all the benefits he would have reaped had he been able to quit the island. But as the young Amelia had merely come to Monte Cristo to fetch him away, he embarked that same evening, and proceeded with the captain to Leghorn. Arrived at Leghorn, he repaired to the house of a Jew, a dealer in precious stones, to whom he disposed of 4 of his smallest diamonds for 5,000 francs each. Dantès half feared that such valuable jewels in the hand of a poor sailor like himself might excite suspicion, but the cunning purchaser asked no troublesome questions concerning a bargain by which he gained a round profit of at least 80%. The following day Dantès presented Jacopo with an entirely new vessel, accompanying the gift by a donation of 100 piastres, that he might provide himself with a suitable crew and other requisites for his outfit, upon condition that he would go at once to Marseilles, for the purpose of inquiring after an old man named Louis Dantès, residing in the Allées de Meilhan, and also a young woman called Mercédès, an inhabitant of the Catalan village. Jacopo could scarcely believe his senses at receiving this magnificent present, which Dantès hastened to account for by saying he had merely been a sailor from whim and a desire to spite his family, who did not allow him as much money as he liked to spend, but that on his arrival at Leghorn he had come into possession of a large fortune, left him by an uncle, whose sole heir he was. The superior education of Dantès gave an air of such extreme probability to this statement that it never once occurred to Jacopo to doubt its accuracy. The term for which Edmond had engaged to serve on board the young Amelia having expired, Dantès took leave of the captain, who had first tried all his powers of persuasion to induce him to remain as one of the crew, but having been told the history of the legacy, he ceased to importune him further. The following morning Jacopo set sail for Marseilles, with directions from Dantès to join him at the island of Monte Cristo. Having seen Jacopo fairly out of the harbor, Dantès proceeded to make his final adieus on board the young Amelia, distributing so liberal a gratuity among her crew as to secure for him the good wishes of all, and expressions of cordial interest in all that concerned him. To the captain he promised to write when he had made up his mind as to his future plans. Then Dantès departed for Genoa. At the moment of his arrival a small yacht was under trial in the bay. This yacht had been built by order of an Englishman, who, having heard that the Genoese exceeded all other builders along the shores of the Mediterranean in the construction of fast-sailing vessels, was desirous of possessing a specimen of their skill. The price agreed upon between the Englishman and the Genoese builder was 40,000 francs. Dantès, struck with the beauty and capability of the little vessel, applied to its owner to transfer it to him, offering 60,000 francs, upon condition that he should be allowed to take immediate possession. The proposal was too advantageous to be refused, the more so as the person for whom the yacht was intended had gone upon a tour through Switzerland, and was not expected back in less than 3 weeks or a month, by which time the builder reckoned upon being able to complete another. A bargain was therefore struck. Dantès led the owner of the yacht to the dwelling of a Jew, retired with the latter for a few minutes to a small back parlor, and upon their return the Jew counted out to the shipbuilder the sum of 60,000 francs in bright gold pieces. The delighted builder then offered his services in providing a suitable crew for the little vessel, but this Dantès declined with many thanks, saying he was accustomed to cruise about quite alone, and his principal pleasure consisted in managing his yacht himself. The only thing the builder could oblige him in would be to contrive a sort of secret closet in the cabin at his bed's head, the closet to contain 3 divisions, so constructed as to be concealed from all but himself. The builder cheerfully undertook the commission, and promised to have these secret places completed by the next day. Dantès furnishing the dimensions and plan in accordance with which they were to be constructed. The following day Dantès sailed with his yacht from Genoa, under the inspection of an immense crowd, drawn together by curiosity to see the rich Spanish nobleman who preferred managing his own yacht. But their wonder was soon changed to admiration at seeing the perfect skill with which Dantès handled the helm. The boat, indeed, seemed to be animated with almost human intelligence, so promptly did it obey the slightest touch. And Dantès required but a short trial of his beautiful craft to acknowledge that the Genoese had not without reason attained their high reputation in the art of shipbuilding. The spectators followed the little vessel with their eyes so long as it remained visible. They then turned their conjectures upon her probable destination. Some insisted she was making for Corsica, others the island of Elba. Bets were offered to any amount that she was bound for Spain, while Africa was positively reported by many persons as her intended course. But no one thought of Monte Cristo. Yet thither it was that Dantès guided his vessel, and at Monte Cristo he arrived at the close of the second day. His boat had proved herself a first-class sailer, and had come the distance from Genoa at 35 hours. Dantès had carefully noted the general appearance of the shore, and instead of landing at the usual place, he dropped anchor in the little creek. The island was utterly deserted, and bore no evidence of having been visited since he went away. His treasure was just as he left it. Early on the following morning he commenced the removal of his riches, and ere nightfall the whole of his immense wealth was safely deposited in the compartments of the secret locker. A week passed by. Dantès employed it in maneuvering his yacht round the island, studying it as a skilful horseman would the animal he destined for some important service, till at the end of that time he was perfectly conversant with its good and bad qualities. The former Dantès proposed to augment, the latter to remedy. Upon the 8th day he discerned a small vessel under full sail approaching Monte Cristo. As it drew near, he recognized it as the boat he had given to Jacopo. He immediately signaled it. His signal was returned, and in 2 hours afterwards the newcomer lay at anchor beside the yacht. A mournful answer awaited each of Edmond's eager inquiries as to the information Jacopo had obtained. Old Dantès was dead, and Mercédès had disappeared. Dantès listened to these melancholy tidings with outward calmness, but leaping lightly ashore, he signified his desire to be quite alone. In a couple of hours he returned. 2 of the men from Jacopo's boat came on board the yacht to assist in navigating it, and he gave orders that she should be steered direct to Marseilles. For his father's death he was in some manner prepared, but he knew not how to account for the mysterious disappearance of Mercédès. Without divulging his secret, Dantès could not give sufficiently clear instructions to an agent. There were, besides, other particulars he was desirous of ascertaining, and those were of a nature he alone could investigate in a manner satisfactory to himself. His looking-glass had assured him, during his stay at Leghorn, that he ran no risk of recognition. Moreover, he had now the means of adopting any disguise he thought proper. One fine morning, then, his yacht, followed by the little fishing boat, boldly entered the port of Marseilles, and anchored exactly opposite the spot from whence, on the never-to-be-forgotten night of his departure for the Château d'If, he had been put on board the boat destined to convey him thither. Still Dantès could not view without a shudder the approach of a gendarme, who accompanied the officers deputed to demand his bill of health ere the yacht was permitted to hold communication with the shore. But with that perfect self-possession he had acquired during his acquaintance with Faria, Dantès coolly presented an English passport he had obtained from Leghorn, and as this gave him a standing which a French passport would not have afforded, he was informed that there existed no obstacle to his immediate debarkation. The first person to attract the attention of Dantès as he landed on the Canebière was one of the crew belonging to the Pharaon. Edmond welcomed the meeting with his fellow, who had been one of his own sailors, as a sure means of testing the extent of the change which time had worked in his own appearance. Going straight toward him, he propounded a variety of questions on different subjects, carefully watching the man's countenance as he did so, but not a word or look implied that he had the slightest idea of ever having seen before the person with whom he was then conversing. Giving the sailor a piece of money in return for his civility, Dantès proceeded onwards, but ere he had gone many steps he heard the man loudly calling to him to stop. Dantès immediately turned to meet him. "I beg your pardon, sir," said the honest fellow in almost breathless haste, "but I believe you made a mistake. You intended to give me a 2-franc piece, and see, you gave me a double Napoleon." "Thank you, my good friend. I see that I have made a trifling mistake, as you say, But by way of rewarding your honesty, I give you another double Napoleon, that you may drink to my health and be able to ask your messmates to join you." So extreme was the surprise of the sailor that he was unable even to thank Edmond, whose receding figure he continued to gaze after in speechless astonishment. "Some nabob from India," was his comment. Dantès, meanwhile, went on his way. Each step he trod oppressed his heart with fresh emotion. His first and most indelible recollections were there. Not a tree, not a street that he passed but seemed filled with dear and cherished memories. And thus he proceeded onwards till he arrived at the end of the Rue de Noailles, from whence a full view of the Allées de Meilhan was obtained. At this spot, so pregnant with fond and filial remembrances, his heart beat almost to bursting, his knees tottered under him, a mist floated over his sight, and had he not clung for support to one of the trees, he would inevitably have fallen to the ground and been crushed beneath the many vehicles continually passing there. Recovering himself, however, he wiped the perspiration from his brows, and stopped not again till he found himself at the door of the house in which his father had lived. The nasturtiums and other plants, which his father had delighted to train before his window, had all disappeared from the upper part of the house. Leaning against the tree, he gazed thoughtfully for a time at the upper stories of the shabby little house. Then he advanced to the door, and asked whether there were any rooms to be let. Though answered in the negative, he begged so earnestly to be permitted to visit those on the 5th floor, that, in despite of the oft-repeated assurance of the concierge that they were occupied, Dantès succeeded in inducing the man to go up to the tenants, and ask permission for a gentleman to be allowed to look at them. The tenants of the humble lodging were a young couple who had been scarcely married a week, and seeing them, Dantès sighed heavily. Nothing in the two small chambers forming the apartments remained as it had been in the time of the elder Dantès. The very paper was different, while the articles of antiquated furniture with which the rooms had been filled in Edmond's time had all disappeared. The four walls alone remained as he had left them. The bed belonging to the present occupants was placed as the former owner of the chamber had been accustomed to have his, and, in spite of his efforts to prevent it, the eyes of Edmond were suffused in tears as he reflected that on that spot the old man had breathed his last, vainly calling for his son. The young couple gazed with astonishment at the sight of their visitor's emotion, and wondered to see the large tears silently chasing each other down his otherwise stern and immovable features. But they felt the sacredness of his grief, and kindly refrained from questioning him as to its cause, while, with instinctive delicacy, they left him to indulge his sorrow alone. When he withdrew from the scene of his painful recollections, they both accompanied him downstairs, reiterating their hope that he would come again whenever he pleased, and assuring him that their poor dwelling would be ever open to him. As Edmond passed the door on the 4th floor, he paused to inquire whether Caderousse the tailor still dwelt there, but he received for reply that the person in question had got into difficulties, and at the present time kept a small inn on the route from Bellegarde to Beaucaire. Having obtained the address of the person to whom the house in the Allées de Meilhan belonged, Dantès next proceeded thither, and under the name of Lord Wilmore, the name and title inscribed on his passport, purchased a small dwelling for the sum of 25,000 francs, at least 10,000 more than it was worth, but had its owner asked 500,000, it would unhesitatingly have been given. The very same day the occupants of the apartments on the 5th floor of the house, now become the property of Dantès, were duly informed by the notary who had arranged the necessary transfer of deeds, that the new landlord gave them their choice of any of the rooms in the house, without the least augmentation of rent, upon condition of their giving instant possession of the two small chambers they at present inhabited. This strange event aroused great wonder and curiosity in the neighborhood of the Allées de Meilhan, and a multitude of theories were afloat, none of which was anywhere near the truth. But what raised public astonishment to a climax, and set all conjecture at defiance, was the knowledge that the same stranger, who had in the morning visited the Allées de Meilhan, had been seen in the evening walking in the little village of the Catallon, and afterwards observed to enter a poor fisherman's hut, and to pass more than an hour in inquiring after persons who had either been dead or gone away for more than 15 or 16 years. But on the following day the family from whom all these particulars had been asked received a handsome present, consisting of an entirely new fishing boat, with 2 signs and a tender. The delighted recipients of these munificent gifts would gladly have poured out their thanks to their generous benefactor, but they had seen him, upon quitting the hut, merely give some orders to a sailor, and then springing lightly on horseback, leave Marseille by the Porte d'Aix. End of chapter 25. Recording by Von Ullman, vonsbooks.com.
Chapter 26 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 26. The Pont du Gard Inn. Such of my readers as have made a pedestrian excursion to the south of France may perchance have noticed, about midway between the town of Beaucaire and the village of Bellegarde, a little nearer to the former than to the latter, a small roadside inn, from the front of which hung, creaking and flapping in the wind, a sheet of tin covered with a grotesque representation of the Pont du Gard. This modern place of entertainment stood on the left-hand side of the post road, and backed upon the Rhône. It also boasted of what in Languedoc is styled a garden, consisting of a small plot of ground on the side opposite to the main entrance reserved for the reception of guests. A few dingy olives and stunted fig trees struggled hard for existence, but their withered, dusty foliage abundantly proved how unequal was the conflict. Between these sickly shrubs grew a scanty supply of garlic, tomatoes, and eschalots, while lone and solitary, like a forgotten sentinel, a tall pine raised its melancholy head in one of the corners of this unattractive spot, and displayed its flexible stem and fan-shaped summit, dried and cracked by the fierce heat of the subtropical sun. In the surrounding plain, which more resembled a dusty lake than solid ground, were scattered a few miserable stalks of wheat, the effect, no doubt, of a curious desire on the part of the agriculturists of the country to see whether such a thing as the raising of grain in those parched regions was practicable. Each stalk served as a perch for a grasshopper, which regaled the passers-by through this Egyptian scene with its strident, monotonous note. For about 7 or 8 years the little tavern had been kept by a man and his wife with 2 servants, a chambermaid named Trinette, and a hostler called Pecot. This small staff was quite equal to all the requirements, for a canal between Beaucaire and Aigues-Mortes had revolutionized transportation by substituting boats for the cart and the stagecoach; and as though to add to the daily misery which this prosperous canal inflicted on the unfortunate innkeeper, whose utter ruin it was fast accomplishing, it was situated between the Rhône, from which it had its source, and the post road it had depleted, not 100 steps from the inn, of which we have given a brief but faithful description. The innkeeper himself was a man of from 40 to 55 years of age, tall, strong, and bony, a perfect specimen of the natives of those southern latitudes. He had dark, sparkling, and deep-set eyes, hooked nose, and teeth white as those of a carnivorous animal. His hair, like his beard, which he wore under his chin, was thick and curly, and in spite of his age but slightly interspersed with a few silvery threads. His naturally dark complexion had assumed a still further shade of brown, from the habit the unfortunate man had acquired of stationing himself from morning till eve at the threshold of his door, on the lookout for guests who seldom came. Yet there he stood day after day, exposed to the meridional rays of a burning sun, with no other protection for his head than a red handkerchief twisted around it, after the manner of the Spanish muleteers. This man was our old acquaintance, Gaspard Caderousse. His wife, on the contrary, whose maiden name had been Madeleine Redel, was pale, meagre, and sickly looking. Born in the neighborhood of Arles, she had shared in the beauty for which its women are proverbial, but that beauty had gradually withered beneath the devastating influence of the slow fever so prevalent among dwellers by the ponds of Aigues-Mortes and the marshes of Camargue. She remained nearly always in her second-floor chamber, shivering in her chair, or stretched languid and feeble on her bed, while her husband kept his daily watch at the door, a duty he performed with so much the greater willingness, as it saved him the necessity of listening to the endless plaints and murmurs of his helpmate, who never saw him without breaking out into bitter invectives against fate, to all of which her husband would calmly return an unvarying reply, in these philosophic words: "Hush, la Carconte, it is God's pleasure that things should be so." The sobriquet of La Carconte had been bestowed on Madeleine Redel from the fact that she had been born in a village, so called, situated between Salon and Lambesc, And as a custom existed among the inhabitants of that part of France where Caderousse lived, of styling every person by some particular and distinctive appellation, her husband had bestowed on her the name of La Carconte, in place of her sweet and euphonious name of Madeleine, which in all probability his rude guttural language would not have enabled him to pronounce. Still, let it not be supposed that amid this affected resignation to the will of Providence, the unfortunate innkeeper did not writhe under the double misery of seeing the hateful canal carry off his customers and his profits, and the daily infliction of his peevish partner's murmurs and lamentations. Like other dwellers in the south, he was a man of sober habits and moderate desires, but fond of external show, vain and addicted to display. During the days of his prosperity, not a festivity took place without himself and wife being among the spectators. He dressed in the picturesque costume worn upon grand occasions by the inhabitants of the south of France, bearing equal resemblance to the style adopted both by the Catalans and Andalusians, while La Carconte displayed the charming fashion prevalent among the women of Arles, a mode of attire borrowed equally from Greece and Arabia. But by degrees, watch chains, necklaces, parti-colored scarfs, embroidered bodices, velvet vests, elegantly worked stockings, striped gaiters, and silver buckles for the shoes, all disappeared, and Gaspard Caderousse, unable to appear abroad in his pristine splendor, had given up any further participation in the pomps and vanities, both for himself and wife, although a bitter feeling of envious discontent filled his mind, as the sound of mirth and merry music from the joyous revellers reached even the miserable hostelry to which he still clung, more for the shelter than the profit it afforded. Caderousse then was as usual at his place of observation before the door, his eyes glancing listlessly from a piece of closely shaven grass, on which some fowls were industriously, though fruitlessly, endeavoring to turn up some grain or insect suited to their palate, to the deserted road, which led away to the north and south, when he was aroused by the shrill voice of his wife, and grumbling to himself as he went, he mounted to her chamber, first taking care, however, to set the entrance door wide open, as an invitation to any chance traveller who might be passing. At the moment Caderousse quitted his sentry-like watch before the door, the road on which he so eagerly strained his sight was void and lonely as a desert at midday. There it lay, stretching out into one interminable line of dust and sand, with its sides bordered by tall, meagre trees, altogether presenting so uninviting an appearance, that no one in his senses could have imagined that any traveller, at liberty to regulate his hours for journeying, would choose to expose himself in such a formidable Sahara. Nevertheless, had Caderousse but retained his post a few minutes longer, he might have caught a dim outline of something approaching from the direction of Bellegarde. As the moving object drew nearer, he would easily have perceived that it consisted of a man and horse, between whom the kindest and most amiable understanding appeared to exist. The horse was of Hungarian breed, and ambled along at an easy pace. His rider was a priest, dressed in black, and wearing a three-cornered hat, and spite of the ardent rays of a noonday sun, the pair came on with a fair degree of rapidity. Having arrived before the Pont du Gard, the horse stopped, but whether for his own pleasure or that of his rider would have been difficult to say. However that might have been, the priest, dismounting, led his steed by the bridle in search of some place to which he could secure him. Availing himself of a handle that projected from a half-fallen door, he tied the animal safely, and having drawn a red cotton handkerchief from his pocket, wiped away the perspiration that streamed from his brow, then, advancing to the door, struck thrice with the end of his iron-shod stick. At this unusual sound, a huge black dog came rushing to meet the daring assailant of his ordinarily tranquil abode, snarling and displaying his sharp white teeth with a determined hostility that abundantly proved how little he was accustomed to society. At that moment a heavy footstep was heard descending the wooden staircase that led from the upper floor, and with many bows and courteous smiles, mine host of the Pont du Gard besought his guest to enter. "You are welcome, sir, most welcome," repeated the astonished Caderousse. "Now then, Margotin," cried he, speaking to the dog, "will you be quiet? Pray don't heed him, sir. He only barks, he never bites. I make no doubt a glass of good wine would be acceptable this dreadfully hot day." Then, perceiving for the first time the garb of the traveller he had to entertain, Caderousse hastily exclaimed, "1,000 pardons! I really did not observe whom I had the honor to receive under my poor roof. What would the abbé please to have? What refreshment can I offer? All I have is at his service." The priest gazed on the person addressing him with a long and searching gaze. There even seemed a disposition on his part to court a similar scrutiny on the part of the innkeeper. Then, observing in the countenance of the latter no other expression than extreme surprise at his own want of attention to an inquiry so courteously worded, he deemed it as well to terminate this dumb show, and therefore said, speaking with a strong Italian accent, "You are, I presume, Monsieur Caderousse?" "Yes, sir," answered the host, even more surprised at the question than he had been by the silence which had preceded it. "I am Gaspard Caderousse, at your service." "Gaspard Caderousse," rejoined the priest. "Yes, Christian and surname are the same. You formerly lived, I believe, in the Allée de Meilhan, on the 4th floor?" "I did." "And you followed the business of a tailor?" "True, I was a tailor till the trade fell off. It is so hot at Marseilles that really I believe that the respectable inhabitants will in time go without any clothing whatever. But talking of heat, is there nothing I can offer you by way of refreshment?" "Yes, let me have a bottle of your best wine, and then, with your permission, we will resume our conversation from where we left off." "As you please, sir," said Caderousse, who, anxious not to lose the present opportunity of finding a customer for one of the few bottles of Cahors still remaining in his possession, hastily raised a trap door in the floor of the apartment they were in, which served both as parlor and kitchen. Upon issuing forth from his subterranean retreat at the expiration of 5 minutes, he found the abbé seated upon a wooden stool, leaning his elbow on a table, while Margotin, whose animosity seemed appeased by the unusual command of the traveller for refreshments, had crept up to him, and had established himself very comfortably between his knees, his long skinny neck resting on his lap, while his dim eye was fixed earnestly on the traveller's face. "Are you quite alone?" inquired the guest, as Caderousse placed before him the bottle of wine and a glass. "Quite alone," replied the man, "or at least practically so, for my poor wife, who is the only person in the house besides myself, is laid up with illness, and unable to render me the least assistance, poor thing." "You are married, then?" said the priest, with a show of interest, glancing round as he spoke at the scanty furnishings of the apartment. "Ah, sir," said Caderousse with a sigh, "it is easy to perceive I am not a rich man, but in this world a man does not thrive the better for being honest." The abbé fixed on him a searching, penetrating glance. "Yes, honest, I can certainly say that much for myself," continued the innkeeper, fairly sustaining the scrutiny of the abbé's gaze. "I can boast with truth of being an honest man, and," continued he significantly, with a hand on his breast and shaking his head, "that is more than everyone can say nowadays." "So much the better for you, if what you assert be true," said the abbé, "for I am firmly persuaded that sooner or later the good will be rewarded and the wicked punished." "Such words as those belong to your profession," answered Caderousse, "and you do well to repeat them. But," added he, with a bitter expression of countenance, "one is free to believe them or not, as one pleases." "You are wrong to speak thus," said the abbé, "and perhaps I may, in my own person, be able to prove to you how completely you are in error." "What mean you?" inquired Caderousse, with a look of surprise. "In the first place, I must be satisfied that you are the person I am in search of. What proofs do you require? Did you, in the year 1814 or 1815, know anything of a young sailor named Dantès?" "Dantès? Did I know poor dear Edmond? Why, Edmond Dantès and myself were intimate friends!" exclaimed Caderousse, whose countenance flushed darkly as he caught the penetrating gaze of the abbé fixed on him, while the clear, calm eye of the questioner seemed to dilate with feverish scrutiny. "You remind me," said the priest, "that the young man concerning whom I asked you was said to bear the name of Edmond." "Said to bear the name?" repeated Caderousse, becoming excited and eager. "Why, he was so called as truly as I myself bore the appellation of Gaspard Caderousse. But tell me, I pray, what has become of poor Edmond? Did you know him? Is he alive and at liberty? Is he prosperous and happy?" "He died a more wretched, hopeless, heart-broken prisoner than the felons who pay the penalty of their crimes at the galleys of Toulon." A deadly pallor followed the flush on the countenance of Caderousse, who turned away, and the priest saw him wiping the tears from his eyes with the corner of the red handkerchief twisted round his head. "Poor fellow, poor fellow!" murmured Caderousse. "Well, there, sir, is another proof that good people are never rewarded on this earth, and that none but the wicked prosper. Ah," continued Caderousse, speaking in the highly colored language of the South, "the world grows worse and worse. Why does not God, if he really hates the wicked, as he is said to do, send down brimstone and fire and consume them altogether?" "You speak as though you had loved this young Dantès," observed the abbé, without taking any notice of his companion's vehemence. "And so I did," replied Caderousse, "though once I confess I envied him his good fortune. But I swear to you, sir, I swear to you by everything a man holds dear, I have since then deeply and sincerely lamented his unhappy fate." There was a brief silence, during which the fixed, searching eye of the abbé was employed in scrutinizing the agitated features of the innkeeper. "You knew the poor lad, then?" continued Caderousse. "I was called to see him on his dying bed, that I might administer to him the consolations of religion." "And of what did he die?" asked Caderousse in a choking voice. "Of what, think you, do young and strong men die in prison when they have scarcely numbered their 30th year, unless it be of imprisonment?" Caderousse wiped away the large beads of perspiration that gathered on his brow. "But the strangest part of the story is," resumed the abbé, "that Dantès, even in his dying moments, swore by his crucified Redeemer that he was utterly ignorant of the cause of his detention." "And so he was," murmured Caderousse. "How should he have been otherwise? Ah, sir, the poor fellow told you the truth, and for that reason he besought me to try and clear up a mystery he had never been able to penetrate, and to clear his memory should any foul spot or stain have fallen on it." And here the look of the abbé, becoming more and more fixed, seemed to rest with ill-concealed satisfaction on the gloomy depression which was rapidly spreading over the countenance of Caderousse. "A rich Englishman," continued the abbé, "who had been his companion in misfortune, but had been released from prison during the second restoration, was possessed of a diamond of immense value. This jewel he bestowed on Dantès, upon himself quitting the prison, as a mark of his gratitude for the kindness and brotherly care with which Dantès had nursed him in a severe illness he underwent during his confinement. Instead of employing this diamond in attempting to bribe his jailers, who might only have taken it and then betrayed him to the governor, Dantès carefully preserved it, that in the event of his getting out of prison he might have wherewithal to live, for the sale of such a diamond would have quite sufficed to make his fortune." "Then I suppose," asked Caderousse with eager, glowing looks, "that it was a stone of immense value?" "Why, everything is relative," answered the abbé. "To one in Edmond's position the diamond certainly was of great value. It was estimated at 50,000 francs." "Bless me!" exclaimed Caderousse. 50,000 francs! Surely the diamond was as large as a nut to be worth all that?" "No," replied the abbé, "it was not of such a size as that; but you shall judge for yourself, I have it with me." The sharp gaze of Caderousse was instantly directed towards the priest's garments, as though hoping to discover the location of the treasure. Calmly drawing forth from his pocket a small box covered with black shagreen, the abbé opened it, and displayed to the dazzled eyes of Caderousse the sparkling jewel it contained, set in a ring of admirable workmanship. "And that diamond," cried Caderousse, almost breathless with eager admiration, "you say is worth 50,000 francs?" "It is, without the setting, which is also valuable," replied the abbé, as he closed the box and returned it to his pocket, while its brilliant hues seemed still to dance before the eyes of the fascinated innkeeper. "But how comes the diamond in your possession, sir? Did Edmond make you his heir?" "No, merely his testamentary executor. I once possessed 4 dear and faithful friends, besides the maiden to whom I was betrothed," he said, "and I feel convinced they have all unfeignedly grieved over my loss. The name of one of the 4 friends is Caderousse." The innkeeper shivered. "Another of the number," continued the abbé, without seeming to notice the emotion of Caderousse, "is called Danglars, and the third, in spite of being my rival, entertained a very sincere affection for me." A fiendish smile played over the features of Caderousse, who was about to break in upon the abbé's speech, when the latter, waving his hand, said, "Allow me to finish first, and then if you have any observations to make, you can do so afterwards. The third of my friends, although my rival, was much attached to me. His name was Fernand. That of my betrothed was—" "Stay, stay," continued the abbé, "I have forgotten what he called her." "Mercédès," said Caderousse eagerly. "True," said the abbé with a stifled sigh, "Mercédès it was." "Go on," urged Caderousse. "Bring me a carafe of water," said the abbé. Caderousse quickly performed the stranger's bidding, and after pouring some into a glass, and slowly swallowing its contents, the abbé, resuming his usual placidity of manner, said, as he placed his empty glass on the table, "Where did we leave off?" "The name of Edmond's betrothed was Mercédès." "To be sure." "You will go to Marseilles," said Dantès, "for you understand I repeat his words just as he uttered them. Do you understand?" "Perfectly." "You will sell this diamond, you will divide the money into 5 equal parts, and give an equal portion to these good friends, the only persons who have loved me upon earth." "But why into 5 parts?" asked Caderousse. "You only mentioned 4 persons." "Because the fifth is dead, as I hear. The fifth sharer in Edmond's bequest was his own father." "Too true, too true," ejaculated Caderousse, almost suffocated by the contending passions which assailed him. "The poor old man did die." "I learned so much at Marseilles," replied the abbé, making a strong effort to appear indifferent; "but from the length of time that has elapsed since the death of the elder Dantès, I was unable to obtain any particulars of his end. Can you enlighten me on that point?" "I do not know who could if I could not," said Caderousse. "Why, I lived almost on the same floor with the poor old man. Ah, yes, about a year after the disappearance of his son, the poor old man died." "Of what did he die?" "Why, the doctors called his complaint gastroenteritis, I believe. His acquaintances say he died of grief; but I, who saw him in his dying moments, I say he died of——" Caderousse paused. "Of what?" asked the priest, anxiously and eagerly. "Why, of downright starvation." "Starvation!" exclaimed the abbé, springing from his seat. "Why, the vilest animals are not suffered to die by such a death as that. The very dogs that wander houseless and homeless in the streets find some pitying hand to cast them a mouthful of bread; and that a man, a Christian, should be allowed to perish of hunger in the midst of other men who call themselves Christians, is too horrible for belief. Oh, it is impossible, utterly impossible." "What I have said, I have said," answered Caderousse. "And you are a fool for having said anything about it," said a voice from the top of the stairs. "Why should you meddle with what does not concern you?" The two men turned quickly, and saw the sickly countenance of La Carconte peering between the baluster rails. Attracted by the sound of voices, she had feebly dragged herself down the stairs, and seated on the lower step, head on knees, she had listened to the foregoing conversation. "Mind your own business, wife," replied Caderousse sharply. "This gentleman asked me for information, which common politeness will not permit me to refuse." "Politeness, you simpleton!" retorted La Carconte. "What have you to do with politeness, I should like to know? Better study a little common prudence. How do you know the motives that person may have for trying to extract all he can from you?" "I pledge you my word, madam," said the abbé, "that my intentions are good, and that your husband can incur no risk, provided he answers me candidly." "Ah, that's all very fine," retorted the woman. "Nothing is easier than to begin with fair promises and assurance of nothing to fear. But when poor silly folks like my husband there have been persuaded to tell all they know, the promises and assurances of safety are quickly forgotten, and at some moment when nobody is expecting it, behold, trouble and misery, and all sorts of persecutions are heaped on the unfortunate wretches who cannot even see whence all their afflictions come. Nay, nay, my good woman, make yourself perfectly easy, I beg of you. Whatever evils may befall you, they will not be occasioned by my instrumentality, that I solemnly promise you." La Carconte muttered a few inarticulate words, then let her head again drop upon her knees, and went into a fit of ague, leaving the two speakers to resume the conversation, but remaining so as to be able to hear every word they uttered. Again the abbé had been obliged to swallow a draught of water, to calm the emotions that threatened to overpower him. When he had sufficiently recovered himself, he said, "It appears, then, that the miserable old man you were telling me of was forsaken by everyone. Surely, had not such been the case, he would not have perished by so dreadful a death." "Why, he was not altogether forsaken," continued Caderousse, "for Mercédès the Catalan and M. Morrel were very kind to him, but somehow the poor old man had contracted a profound hatred for Fernand, the very person," added Caderousse with a bitter smile, "that you named just now as being one of Dantès' faithful and attached friends." "And was he not so?" asked the abbé. "Gaspard, Gaspard," murmured the woman from her seat on the stairs, "mind what you are saying." Caderousse made no reply to these words, though evidently irritated and annoyed by the interruption; but addressing the abbé, said, "Can a man be faithful to another whose wife he covets and desires for himself? But Dantès was so honorable and true in his own nature, that he believed everybody's professions of friendship. Poor Edmond, he was cruelly deceived, but it was fortunate that he never knew, or he might have found it more difficult when on his deathbed to pardon his enemies. And whatever people may say," continued Caderousse in his native language, which was not altogether devoid of rude poetry, "I cannot help being more frightened at the idea of the malediction of the dead than the hatred of the living." "Imbecile!" exclaimed La Carconte. "Do you, then, know in what manner Fernand injured Dantès?" inquired the abbé of Caderousse. "Do I? No one better." "Speak out, then; say what it was." "Gaspard!" cried La Carconte, "do as you will, you are master, but if you take my advice, you'll hold your tongue." "Well, wife," replied Caderousse, "I don't know but what you are right." "So you will say nothing?" asked the abbé. "Why, what good would it do?" asked Caderousse. "If the poor lad were living and came to me and begged that I would candidly tell which were his true and which his false friends, why, perhaps I should not hesitate. But you tell me he is no more, and therefore can have nothing to do with hatred or revenge, so let all such feeling be buried with him." "You prefer, then," said the abbé, "that I should bestow on men you say are false and treacherous the reward intended for faithful friendship?" "That is true enough," returned Caderousse. "You say truly the gift of poor Edmond was not meant for such traitors as Fernand and Danglars. Besides, what would it be to them? No more than a drop of water in the ocean." "Remember," chimed in La Carconte, "those two could crush you at a single blow." "How so?" inquired the abbé. "Are these persons then so rich and powerful? Do you not know their history?" "I do not. Pray relate it to me." Caderousse seemed to reflect for a few moments, and said, "No, truly, it would take up too much time." "Well, my good friend," returned the abbé, in a tone that indicated utter indifference on his part, "you are at liberty either to speak or be silent, just as you please. For my own part, I respect your scruples and admire your sentiments. So let the matter end. I shall do my duty as conscientiously as I can, and fulfill my promise to the dying man. My first business will be to dispose of this diamond." So saying, the abbé again drew the small box from his pocket, opened it, and contrived to hold it in such a light that a bright flash of brilliant hues passed before the dazzled gaze of Caderousse. "Wife, wife," cried he, in a hoarse voice, "come here." "Diamond!" exclaimed La Carconte, rising and descending to the chamber with a tolerably firm step. "What diamond are you talking about?" "Why, did you not hear all we said?" inquired Caderousse. "It is a beautiful diamond left by poor Edmond Dantès, to be sold, and the money divided between his father, Mercédès his betrothed bride, Fernand, Danglars, and myself. The jewel is worth at least 50,000 francs." "Oh, what a magnificent jewel!" cried the astonished woman. "The fifth part of the profits from this stone belongs to us, then, does it not?" asked Caderousse. "It does," replied the abbé, "with the addition of an equal division of that part intended for the elder Dantès, which I believe myself at liberty to divide equally with the 4 survivors." "And why among us 4?" inquired Caderousse. "As being the friends Edmond esteemed most faithful and devoted to him." "I don't call those friends who betray and ruin you," murmured the wife in her turn, in a low, muttering voice. "Of course not," rejoined Caderousse quickly. "No more do I, and that was what I was observing to this gentleman just now. I said I looked upon it as a sacrilegious profanation to reward treachery, perhaps crime." "Remember," answered the abbé calmly, as he replaced the jewel and its case in the pocket of his cassock, "it is your fault, not mine, that I do so. You will have the goodness to furnish me with the address of both Fernand and Danglars, in order that I may execute Edmond's last wishes." The agitation of Caderousse became extreme, and large drops of perspiration rolled from his heated brow. As he saw the abbé rise from his seat and go towards the door, as though to ascertain if his horse was sufficiently refreshed to continue his journey, Caderousse and his wife exchanged looks of deep meaning. "There, you see, wife," said the former, "this splendid diamond might all be ours if we chose." "Do you believe it?" "Why, surely a man of his holy profession would not deceive us." "Well," replied La Carconte, "do as you like. For my part, I wash my hands of the affair." So saying, she once more climbed the staircase leading to her chamber, her body convulsed with chills, and her teeth rattling in her head, in spite of the intense heat of the weather. Arrived at the top stairs, she turned round, and called out in a warning tone to her husband, "Gaspard, consider well what you are about to do." "I have both reflected and decided," answered he. La Carconte then entered her chamber, the flooring of which creaked beneath her heavy uncertain tread, as she proceeded towards her armchair, into which she fell as though exhausted. "Well," asked the abbé, as he returned to the apartment below, "what have you made up your mind to do?" "To tell you all I know," was the reply. "I certainly think you act wisely in so doing," said the priest, "not because I have the least desire to learn anything you may please to conceal from me, but simply that if, through your assistance, I could distribute the legacy according to the wishes of the testator, why, so much the better. That is all." "I hope it may be so," replied Caderousse, his face flushed with cupidity. "I am all attention," said the abbé. "Stop a minute," answered Caderousse. "We might be interrupted in the most interesting part of my story, which would be a pity, and it is as well that your visit hither should be made known only to ourselves." With these words he went stealthily to the door, which he closed, and by way of still greater precaution bolted and barred it, as he was accustomed to do at night. During this time the abbé had chosen his place for listening at his ease. He removed his seat into a corner of the room, where he himself would be in deep shadow, while the light would be fully thrown on the narrator. Then, with head bent down and hands clasped, or rather clinched together, he prepared to give his whole attention to Caderousse, who seated himself on the little stool exactly opposite to him. "Remember, this is no affair of mine," said the trembling voice of La Carconte, as though through the flooring of her chamber she viewed the scene that was enacting below. "Enough, enough," replied Caderousse. "Say no more about it. I will take all the consequences upon myself." And he began his story. Chapter 27.